Some encounters are so fateful they stop the world in its tracks. When innocence clashes with cruelty, when fragile faith confronts the unyielding fortress of science, that is the moment two opposite worlds collide. One September morning, on the lawns of billionaire Richard Whitmore's sprawling 300-acre Connecticut estate, such an impossible moment occurred. A poor black boy named Marcus Harris stood before the most powerful and ruthless man in America, and boldly declared that he could cure the paralysis that had tormented Richard for the past 5 years. Richard Whitmore wasn't just wealthy. He was the very embodiment of absolute power and merciless coldness. Since the horrific car accident 5 years earlier, he had run a multi-billion-dollar financial empire from his wheelchair. He possessed everything anyone could ever want, except one thing: the ability to walk on his own 2 feet. That lack only deepened his bitterness and kept him simmering with barely contained rage. The mansion he called home was more than a residence. It was a monument to power and pride, yet also a testament to utter solitude. Within those pristine white walls, Richard wielded control through fear and absolute authority. Everyone who worked for him tread lightly, mindful that the smallest misstep could cost them everything. That day, Richard's face held its usual cold severity. His ice-sharp gaze stared through the office window at the meticulously kept gardens below. But that facade of calm shattered the moment he spotted longtime gardener Joseph Peterson accidentally trampling the newly trimmed grass, leaving an unsightly blot of dirt. Richard clenched his fist as anger surged within him. He signaled to his personal assistant, Margaret Evans, "Bring Joseph in here at once." Joseph entered, the 60-year-old man bowing his head, worry etched on his features. He had devoted over 20 years to tending the Whitmore gardens as though they were masterpieces. But to Richard, loyalty meant nothing when accompanied by even the slightest error. Richard's voice was ice-cold, each word a sharpened blade. "You've worked here 2 decades, Joseph, and you still don't understand that perfection is the only thing I demand. You trample on fresh grass and leave a stain. Do you think this is some kind of joke?" Joseph trembled as he tried to explain. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Whitmore. It was an oversight and—" Richard cut him off mercilessly. "Silence. I don't need your apologies. Even the smallest mistake is unacceptable here. You're fired. And don't think of asking me for a letter of recommendation. You aren't worthy." Stunned, Joseph fell to his knees, begging, "Mr. Whitmore, please reconsider. My wife is gravely ill, and we have young grandchildren to care for. I beg you—" Richard sneered, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "You should have thought of your family before making that stupid mistake. Margaret, call James. Have him remove this man from the grounds immediately." Joseph's desperate pleas faded as he was dragged away. Richard remained in his wheelchair, expression impassive as he watched the garden. His anger had cooled, but his soul was still cloaked in loneliness and cruelty, feelings he had come to revel in. Seeing others kneel and beg gave him proof that he was still alive, that he still held absolute power. Just then, security assistant James entered with an uneasy look. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a boy at the gate. He's been waiting for 2 hours and refuses to leave." Richard frowned in irritation. "A child? What does he want?" James hesitated, then said, "He claims he can cure your condition. He seems very serious." Richard burst into mocking laughter, a strange blend of curiosity and amusement stirring within him. A poor child daring to promise what dozens of the world's greatest doctors had failed to achieve. It was absurd, but intriguing enough to pique his interest. "All right," he said with contempt. "Bring that boy in here. I'll show him the consequences of pestering someone like me with such foolish antics." 15 minutes later, the office door swung open. James led in a small black boy dressed in simple but clean clothes. This was Marcus Harris. His eyes were calm and shone with confidence, a sharp contrast to the poverty his worn outfit betrayed. Richard looked Marcus up and down, his voice dripping with scorn. "So, you're the child prodigy who claims he can heal my legs? Do you know, I've spent tens of millions of dollars on the greatest doctors on this planet and I'm still stuck in this damned wheelchair?" Marcus remained composed. His gaze never wavered as he faced the most powerful man in America. His voice was soft but resolute, as if stating an undeniable truth. "Mr. Whitmore, you can go ahead and prepare the check because I guarantee I will cure you." Marcus's words echoed through the opulent room, creating a heavy, suffocating silence. Richard found himself struck by something extraordinary in the boy's eyes, not fear, but unwavering faith, mysterious and intense, something he had never seen before. In that instant, the two utterly opposing worlds truly collided. A fateful encounter had taken place, heralding monumental changes to come, changes that even Richard Whitmore could never have foreseen. The silence that followed Marcus's confident words swept through Richard Whitmore's luxurious office like an icy breeze. He unconsciously gripped the arms of his wheelchair, the all-too-familiar pang of helplessness rising once more to consume his every thought. Marcus's declaration, "Go ahead and have your check ready," echoed relentlessly in Richard's mind. Richard loathed that feeling of powerlessness more than anything else in the world. For 5 years, each morning he woke was a battle against deep disappointment and despair. The horrifying memories of the accident were etched in his mind. His beloved sports car losing control, plummeting down the gravel-strewn embankment, the violent spins, the metal twisting, and the searing pain as he came to in the hospital. Since that fateful day, his lower body had been completely paralyzed, and he'd become a prisoner of this wheelchair. Richard had once placed absolute faith in the limitless power of money and science. With his vast fortune, he'd hired the world's leading experts, renowned doctors from the U.S., Europe, and Asia. He spared no expense on experimental therapies, multi-hour surgeries, and grueling months of rehabilitation. Yet every effort proved futile. Each celebrated physician and illustrious specialist ultimately shook their head in regret, offering him nothing but pity, and that was something he despised more than their failures. At times, his despair reached a fever pitch, driving him nearly mad. Each time he received results from a new trial, Richard exploded in rage. He remembered vividly the day he got the call from Dr. Thomas Parker, one of the foremost neurologists in the world. Parker had flown in from London to meet him in Connecticut, bringing the findings Richard had clung to with such desperate hope. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Parker said, regret heavy in his voice, "I'm very sorry, but every test confirms that the damage to your spinal cord is irreversible. I've employed the most advanced treatments available, but nothing has worked." Richard could hardly contain his fury. He screamed in rage, sweeping every object off his desk, smashing an antique vase into shards on the floor. "So, you're telling me that all the money, all the prestige, research, and credentials you possess are worthless? You're all incompetent fools." Dr. Parker, pale and stunned, fought to stay calm. "I understand how painful this is for you, but the truth is that medicine still has its limits. We've done everything we can." Richard roared, his voice shaking the room. "Everything you can? I've spent millions, flown in geniuses like you from around the globe, and what do I have to show for it? Nothing but excuses and your condescending pity." From that day on, Richard cut off communication with Doctor. Parker, and a string of other specialists. His cruelty only deepened. His resentment and hatred toward the world festered in his soul. He began to believe that everything had betrayed him. Money, reputation, science, none of it meant anything against this cruel disease that had stolen his once vibrant life. And now, before him stood a poor, uneducated child. No degrees, no credentials, daring to claim something impossible that the world's finest experts insisted could not be done. Insult and curiosity warred within him, and he could not suppress his intrigue. "Marcus Harris," he said mockingly, "you're just an 8-year-old boy with no medical knowledge. What makes you think you can do what those great minds could not?" Marcus met Richard's gaze unflinchingly, his calm resolve undimmed. "Sir, they only looked at what was broken. I look at what still remains whole inside you. What matters isn't what has been lost, but what is waiting to awaken again." Richard let out a bitter, furious laugh. He couldn't believe this child dared to lecture him so boldly. "Listen, boy genius, all those experts I've hired, from Harvard, Oxford, Stanford, are the best on this planet. And you, with your so-called miraculous insight, claim to do what the entire world says is impossible. What a fool's game." Marcus stood firm in the face of Richard's wrath, replying gently but with unwavering conviction. "You've spent millions to heal your body, but you've never truly believed you could recover. The problem isn't that your legs don't work. It's that your belief died long ago." For the first time, Richard was taken aback by that unexpected answer. A chill silence once more engulfed the opulent room, as though heralding the fierce struggle about to begin between despair and hope, belief and science. This was the battle that would determine the future of Richard Whitmore, the most powerful, yet most desperate man alive. The icy words of Marcus fell like a pebble into the still lake of Richard's mind, sending ripples of unease through the opulent room. For a heartbeat, Richard was almost mesmerized by the boy's uncanny calm, but he immediately snapped back to his usual icy composure, masking the fleeting confusion. Richard burst into a loud, mocking laugh, dripping with derision. "Who do you think you are, Marcus Harris? Some little angel, or an 8-year-old medical genius who can rewrite the laws of science?" Marcus didn't flinch. His confidence held steady. "I'm not an angel, Mr. Whitmore. I'm simply someone who can see what your doctors cannot. They try to fix what's broken, while I know how to awaken what still sleeps within your body." Richard arched a brow, curiosity stirring. In all his years, he'd never encountered anyone bold enough to challenge his absolute faith in science and the power of money, let alone a poor child. Something about Marcus both irritated and compelled him. Leaning forward in his wheelchair, closing the distance between them, Richard's gaze sharpened. "All right, you clever boy. If you truly believe in your ability, I'll give you one shot to prove it. But let me make this crystal clear. This is no joke. If you succeed where the finest minds in medicine, from Harvard to Johns Hopkins to the Mayo Clinic, have failed, I'll hand you $1 million in cash." "That's right, $1 million. Marcus nodded serenely, as if the proposition were perfectly natural. "I accept your challenge, Mr. Whitmore. Have your money ready, because I guarantee I will cure you." Richard's smile twisted from mocking to venomous. He no longer saw Marcus as a mere child, but as someone brazen enough to defy him, and the lifetime of absolute power he'd amassed. He felt a deep outrage. He laughed again, the sound echoing through the vast office to underline the gulf between them. "Marcus, let me spell it out for you. You're nothing. A poor kid who's probably never set foot in a decent school, let alone understands medicine. Do you really believe you can achieve what the world's top experts have declared impossible? Marcus remained unshaken, his eyes unwavering. They have knowledge and credentials, but they lack belief. I have faith. Richard scoffed, his voice sharpening into a blade. Faith? Faith is a delusion for the weak. Reality runs on power, money, and science. Your words only prove how little you understand about life. He paused, hostility blazing in his gaze as he stared down at Marcus. I'm genuinely curious, Marcus Harris. What gives you the right to show up here and spout this nonsense? You're just a forgotten kid. Do you really think your empty words can change your pitiful fate? The room fell into suffocating silence. Every one of Richard's insults struck the air like a dagger. Yet Marcus did not waver or retreat before America's most powerful man. Instead, his clear eyes now held a hint of pity, not for himself, but for the rich, tormented man across from him. Marcus spoke quietly, with unwavering certainty. Mr. Whitmore, I have no power, no money, and none of the prestigious titles you mention. But I possess something you've never truly owned: belief in the strength of the human spirit. You've forgotten how to believe in yourself, and that's why you remain trapped in that wheelchair. Richard's grip tightened as if Marcus's words threatened the fortress he'd built over 5 years. For the first time in many years, he felt a flicker of fear seep into his proud, powerful heart. But he quickly masked his turmoil with his customary icy stare. We'll see, Marcus. I want to watch you fail, so you can learn the painful truth. Your faith means nothing against the absolute power of science and my wealth. Marcus simply offered a gentle smile and nodded, as though he were ready for whatever lay ahead. The charged silence settled again, heralding a brutal contest not between two individuals but between two utterly different worlds, one of despair, the other of faith, where only one can endure. The tense silence had barely settled when Marcus's soft but resolute voice cut through the room once more. Prepare the check, Mr. Whitmore. $1 million, just as you promised. Richard froze for a moment, his cold eyes revealing for the first time genuine uncertainty at Marcus's eerily calm demeanor. The boy's gentle yet unwavering words struck like a challenge, an arrow aimed straight at Richard's pride. It had been ages since he'd felt this strange, quiet unease creeping into his mind. Determined to banish the doubt, Richard forced himself back into his usual icy posture. He wouldn't let a child see any weakness in him. Instead, he turned to his familiar weapon: sarcasm, underscoring the absurdity of Marcus's claim with every prestigious credential he'd come to trust. With a flick of his remote, the large screen behind his desk descended. One by one, images appeared before Marcus: stern faces, illustrious names, world-renowned medical honors. Richard pointed to the first photo, his voice dripping with irony. Do you know who this is, Marcus? Dr. Thomas Parker, professor of neuroscience at Harvard University. He's dedicated his life to researching and treating spinal cord injuries. Countless international awards to his name. When my accident happened, he was the first person I called. And do you know the result? He failed. Marcus's expression never wavered. He simply met Richard's stare. This only fueled Richard's sense of challenge. He advanced to the next image, his tone sharpening. This is Dr. Helena Morgan, a leading rehabilitation specialist at Johns Hopkins. I paid her over $3 million for a 6-month recovery program. And the outcome? Nothing. Still couldn't stand. Richard sneered, pointing to the next photo. And this is Professor Akira Tanaka, a stem cell research genius from Tokyo. He vowed his methods could reverse any neurological damage. Yet, after all those costly trials I funded, what happened? I'm still here, paralyzed, with no progress." He paused, contempt in his gaze. "So, Marcus Harris, an 8-year-old boy who's never set foot in a top medical school, never spent a day in a lab, do you really think you can succeed where all these experts have failed? Are you naive or arrogant?" Marcus stepped forward calmly, unshaken by the credentials or the scorn. In a soft, determined voice he replied, "Mr. Whitmore, I don't deny these people are experts, geniuses even, but there's one crucial thing they all lacked. Faith. Faith in your ability to recover." Richard arched an eyebrow, challenging him. "Faith? That same wishful nonsense? Faith can't regenerate nerve cells, Marcus. Faith can't repair a shattered spine. Only science, modern technology, and therapies can do that, and they've all failed me." Marcus shook his head, a hint of sadness in his clear eyes at Richard's words. Gently, he explained, voice still confident. "That's what you've misunderstood for 5 years, Mr. Whitmore. Science can do incredible things, but it cannot restore the deepest conviction in a person's heart. When you lost faith in your own healing, you built a wall that blocked your true recovery." Richard laughed coldly, fighting to conceal the growing unease behind his familiar facade. "Marcus, you sure know how to make me both furious and pity you at the same time. You really think that believing in something will make it real. That's the kind of fairy tale poor people tell themselves to escape the harsh truth of life." Marcus held Richard's gaze, each word soft but cutting like an invisible blade, breaking down the powerful man's defenses. "Sir, you built your life on the power of money and science, but now those very things have betrayed you, because you've never once believed that you yourself could perform a miracle, and that's why you've never stood up from that wheelchair." For the first time in his life of absolute power, Richard Whitmore felt himself shaken to the core. Marcus's gentle words were steadily dismantling the wall of despair he'd built over 5 years. This was a relentless war between faith and doubt, a battle that would decide the fate of a man who was powerful, yet had lost faith in himself. The moment Marcus's words fell silent, Richard felt as though a fierce storm had just swept through his mind, shattering every wall of reason he'd painstakingly built. He'd never imagined that a small, impoverished boy could unleash such profound chaos in his thoughts. Richard's instinct urged him to quash this doubt immediately, to reassert total control over the situation. But before he could even muster a rebuttal, Marcus quietly posed a question as if he'd peered straight into Richard's tumultuous mind. "Mr. Whitmore, have you ever truly tried? I mean, have you genuinely struggled to stand on your own? Or have you simply handed everything over to famous doctors and waited for them to perform miracles for you?" Richard stared at Marcus in shock, his eyes widening in disbelief. The doubt in Marcus's tone ignited a sudden fury. His face flushed crimson and all composure vanished. The rage he'd held in check for years erupted uncontrollably. "Tried?" Richard thundered, his voice echoing like a clap of thunder through the grand office. "You dare say I never tried? I've spent millions of dollars, Marcus. I've hired the world's greatest experts, endured the most excruciating experimental treatments, and even survived surgeries that lasted for hours. Do you have any idea what it means to truly try?" Marcus stood his ground, unmoved by Richard's fury. His steady, unafraid gaze only deepened Richard's sense of insult. Richard continued, unable to contain himself. "I've undergone 17 major surgeries, Marcus. 17 agonizing operations, all for a sliver of hope that I might stand again. I've taken drugs that doctors themselves hesitated to test on others. And you have the nerve to ask if I've ever really tried. What do you know of effort, you pitiful child?" The tension in the room soared to a white-hot peak. Everything seemed frozen in that instant. Richard panted, his body trembling with anger, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Marcus as if he could incinerate the boy with his stare. Yet Marcus did not flinch. Rather than cower before the outburst, he held Richard's gaze calmly and spoke softly but with cutting clarity. "But you're still in that wheelchair, Mr. Whitmore." Those 6 simple words struck Richard at his core, leaving him momentarily speechless. That harsh truth awoke the deepest pain in his soul, the pain he'd hidden behind power, wealth, and false pride. Marcus had exposed not only the weakness of his body, but also the fracture in his faith. In the terrifying hush that followed, Marcus's gentle yet incisive voice continued, "You placed your complete faith in money, in science, in those renowned doctors, but you've never believed in yourself. You never asked if you could be the one to create a miracle. You entrusted your healing to strangers and blamed them when they failed. But the real failure was your own, the moment you abandoned belief in yourself." Richard felt as though Marcus's calm words were tearing down the fortress of despair he'd erected over 5 long years. Each syllable was a cold blade slicing into the pride and arrogance that had become his armor. For the first time, Richard Whitmore couldn't muster his usual sarcasm, because he too sensed the cracks forming in the walls of conviction he'd always clung to. He forced himself to steady his breath and, though his tone still bore a challenge, it lacked its former confidence. "So, what do you suggest I do, Marcus? Simply sit here and believe my legs will heal on their own because I wish it so? If it were that easy, none of this would have been necessary." For the first time, a flicker of pity shone in Marcus's eyes as he looked at Richard. "No, sir. What I want you to do is tear down the wall of despair you've built around yourself. I want you to believe, but not in me or in those doctors. What matters most is that you believe in yourself. As long as you harbor fear of failure and deep doubt, no amount of money, no matter how many millions, will ever lift you from that wheelchair." Marcus's final words fell into the stunned silence. The man who once commanded a financial empire now found himself utterly unable to respond. In that moment, Richard Whitmore's absolute faith in science and wealth shattered under the cold calm of a poor boy's truth. For the first time, Richard realized that he himself had surrendered long before the real battle had even begun. The room falls into suffocating silence after Marcus's final words. In Richard Whitmore's mind, those words ring out like an urgent alarm, echoing over and over. What if the best doctors were wrong? For the first time in years of basking in the absolute certainty and security that money and science provide, Richard feels doubt creeping into his thoughts. He hates this feeling. It makes him feel weaker and more powerless than ever. Yet worse than that is his inability to deny that Marcus's question has struck a hidden fear he's always worked to conceal. The fear that science, the very thing he trusted without question, might be fallible. In the days that follow, Richard cannot sleep. Each night he lies awake in his lavish bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, desperate for answers in the darkness. Faces of renowned experts and celebrated doctors parade through his mind, the proud, confident expressions they wore when admitting defeat to his condition. But amid all those familiar faces, Marcus's steady, confident gaze stands out, a relentless challenge he can't banish. Richard tries to comfort himself by insisting Marcus is just a naive child, too inexperienced to understand science's complexities. Yet, each time he soothes himself this way, The question rings louder, more haunting. What if the top experts are wrong? What if Marcus is right? Unable to endure this mental torment any longer, Richard places an urgent call to his personal physician and longtime friend, Dr. Samuel Bennett. The next morning, Dr. Bennett arrives at Richard's office. The older doctor, with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor, looks at Richard in mild surprise. "Richard, why did you call me in such a hurry? Is something wrong with your health?" Richard is silent for a moment, exhaustion in his eyes, then lowers his voice as if hesitating. "Samuel, tell me once more, clearly and definitively. Is there any possibility, no matter how small, that we, including you, have been wrong in concluding I could never recover?" Dr. Bennett is taken aback by the unexpected question. He studies Richard carefully, as if trying to read the deeper turmoil behind it. "Richard, I know you're tired and frustrated, but let me repeat. Based on every test, every image, and dozens of treatment trials, the damage to your spinal cord is permanent and irreversible. That's not conjecture, but solid scientific conclusion, and the world's top doctors agree." Richard says nothing, staring at Samuel with a rare look of confusion. He had hoped for reassurance. Instead, the answer only deepens his unrest. Sensing this, Dr. Bennett tries to comfort his old friend. "Richard, you've always been logical and practical. Why this sudden doubt? Has someone been planting unrealistic ideas in your head?" Richard gives a bitter laugh, his voice weary and sharp. "An 8-year-old boy made me question it, Samuel. That boy claimed he could cure me. At first, I dismissed it as a joke. Now, I can't shake the question." Dr. Bennett frowns, concern etching his features. "Richard, that's childlike fantasy. You can't let nonsense words cloud your mind. Remember, the science and the experts you've worked with have dedicated their lives to this field. Is it conceivable that a small child could overturn all that?" Richard remains silent, torn between reason and this irrational obsession. His voice drops to a near whisper, as if speaking more to himself than to Samuel. "But what if everything we've believed for so long is wrong? What if I was the one misplacing my faith from the very start?" Dr. Bennett falls silent at that skeptical question. For the first time, he sees the confident, powerful Richard laid bare in deep confusion. The doctor sighs softly, his tone almost paternal. "Richard, maybe this isn't about your body but your mind. Perhaps you're exhausted and beginning to doubt everything, but science, though not perfect, is built on undeniable facts and evidence. If you let your mind chase the impossible, you'll lose yourself." Richard nods faintly, but his eyes remain distant and unsettled. He now realizes even Samuel cannot free him from this obsession. Marcus's words were more than a challenge. They're a persistent curse he doesn't know how to escape. Dr. Bennett rises to leave, and Richard is left alone in the engulfing silence. He remains seated at his desk, gazing out the large window as Marcus's question echoes once more, a relentless whisper. What if the best doctors were wrong? In that moment, for the first time in his life of power and certainty, Richard Whitmore feels his absolute faith in science and the power of money begin to crack, and he doesn't know what to hold on to find peace again. In the days that followed, Marcus's haunting question continued to torment Richard so relentlessly that he could think of nothing else. Each silent night brought deeper doubts, plunging him into an abyss of unease. The certainty and security that science had provided his entire life began to fracture into frighteningly small pieces, leaving behind a yawning void. Just when Richard was on the brink of despair, Marcus reappeared as if by instinct. Calm, assured, knowing exactly when Richard needed him most. The office door swung open slowly, and Marcus stepped in, still dressed simply, but his presence now felt even stronger and more radiant than before. Richard looked up at him, torn between relief and fury. "You're here to plant more of your nonsense in my head?" Richard snapped, his tone laced with bitter sarcasm and an unmistakable desperation. Marcus offered a small, fearless smile. "No, Mr. Whitmore, I'm here to help you face the truth you've been running from. If you want to stand again, you must stop thinking like a patient." Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Stop thinking like a patient? How helpful, from a boy who's never known the agony I've endured. I've been paralyzed for 5 years, Marcus. That's not something you can simply stop thinking about. My body is completely immobile. Fact, not folly." Marcus stood quietly for a moment, then took a step closer, his clear eyes full of unshakable conviction. "Mr. Whitmore, your body may be still, but that's because your mind has long since abandoned it. I want you to try something simple. Speak to your legs. Tell them you need them to move again." Richard recoiled, outraged at the absurdity. "Speak to my legs? Marcus, you're making me look like a fool. I'm a man of reason, someone who's placed absolute faith in science. I'm no superstitious dreamer like you." Marcus remained unruffled. "You've tried everything science could offer, but you've never truly communicated with your own body. Why not give yourself that chance?" "Because it's absurd," Richard shouted, face flushed, breathing ragged. "Every test, every doctor, every scientific theory has said, my body cannot heal. I trusted them. I invested every cent and ounce of faith in the world's best. And now you tell me to forget it all and talk to my dead legs? Marcus, you're insane." The tension in the room tightened to the breaking point. Marcus held Richard's gaze, and for the first time his tone was stern, almost commanding. "No, Mr. Whitmore, I'm not insane, but you are afraid. You're terrified to admit you might have been wrong all these years. You're afraid to acknowledge that you never truly gave yourself a chance to heal. That is the most pitiable thing of all." Richard stood frozen, struck as though Marcus's words had struck him across the face. He stared at the boy, and for the first time in his life felt a profound weakness flood his mind. In that instant, his rational, scientific faith wavered for the first time. Marcus stepped even closer, his voice softer but no less powerful. "You've tried everything except the simplest thing. Speak to your own body, Mr. Whitmore. Just once, please." Richard hesitated, torn between scorn and a flicker of hope. Deep down, a small, desperate voice whispered that maybe Marcus was right. Finally, surrendering to that whisper, he agreed to do what he had always dismissed as nonsense. Reluctantly, Richard closed his eyes. His hand trembled as he placed it on his motionless legs. His voice was barely above a whisper, heavy with doubt but laced with the tiniest spark of hope. "Legs, if you're still there, give me a sign, even the smallest one." He waited, every second stretching with tension. Nothing happened. Richard was about to pull his hand away and laugh at his own foolishness when, just as he prepared to open his eyes, a subtle, unmistakable awareness blossomed where his hand rested. It wasn't a movement or a sensation in the ordinary sense. It was simply a faint awakening, but for Richard, it was enough to leave him utterly stunned, his eyes flying open in astonishment. Marcus stood quietly, a gentle smile on his lips, as though he'd known this would happen all along. In that vast room, for the first time in 5 years of despair, Richard Whitmore felt the spark of life return to the legs he had long thought dead. It was the moment he finally confronted true belief, a belief that neither science nor money could buy. The belief in himself. The faint awakening Richard felt in his legs left him both astonished and terrified. For the first time in years of despair, he sensed a small, fragile spark of life within his body. Yet, his unwavering belief in science instantly surged back, rebelling fiercely against this moment of vulnerability. Richard yanked his hand away from his legs as if he'd touched something forbidden. His voice trembled with a mix of anger and emotion as he glared at Marcus. "What have you done to me, Marcus? What cheap psychological trick are you playing to make me lose my mind?" Marcus showed no sign of surprise at Richard's outburst. He stood his ground, calm and resolute, his clear eyes locking onto Richard's. In a quiet but razor-sharp tone, he methodically dismantled Richard's last defenses. "I did nothing, Mr. Whitmore. What you felt was your own body responding to your mind's call. What I want to know is, have you ever truly tried believing in yourself instead of relying on famous doctors?" Richard was too stunned to speak for a moment, but then pride and wounded belief exploded into a furious roar. He couldn't bear being questioned by a poor child about the faith he'd invested his entire life in. Believe in myself? Marcus, do you even know what you're talking about? I've spent 5 years and tens of millions of dollars trusting the most credentialed experts. I paid $2 million for a rehabilitation program at Johns Hopkins, another $3 million for an experimental neurosurgery at Stanford, and $4 million for stem cell therapy in Tokyo. And now you dare ask if I've ever tried believing in myself? His voice grew more strident, every word steeped in the deepest despair and hurt. Richard, who had never shown weakness before anyone, was now completely unhinged. "I believed in people who could prove their abilities, Marcus. I believed in science. Facts validated by clear evidence, and yet here I sit, listening to an 8-year-old lecture me that I've never believed in myself." Silence fell heavy once he paused for breath, his chest heaving with anger and the raw emotion he'd long suppressed. Marcus remained calm, unafraid, and replied in an equally cold, devastatingly simple tone. "And you still can't stand, Mr. Whitmore." That brief, powerful statement hit Richard like a direct blow. Everything he'd built, every argument he'd made, crumbled before his eyes. He felt as if he'd plunged from a great height, drowning in an overwhelming sense of hopelessness and disorientation. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. In that moment, for the first time in his life of absolute power and pride, Richard Whitmore truly doubted the pillars he'd always regarded as absolute truths. His prestigious degrees, accolades, and scientific standing no longer shielded him against Marcus's simple, penetrating words. His once unshakable confidence was cracking, shards of doubt piercing through to reveal a terrified, lonely soul beneath. Marcus looked at Richard with a gentler expression, as if he understood the crisis unfolding in the man before him. His voice softened but remained powerful. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't deny the efforts you've made, but true belief must come from within. You can't outsource it. Those doctors and specialists have knowledge and credentials, but they can't live your life or perform miracles on your behalf. Only you can do that." Richard sat motionless, his gaze distant and unfocused, no longer sharp or proud. His mind raced. The absolute faith he'd nurtured all his life was now perilously unsteady, leaving behind a haunting emptiness. Marcus had exposed the most frightening truth in Richard's mind. He had never truly believed in his own power to heal, always placing his faith and the burden of responsibility on others, only to blame them when they failed. At last, Richard spoke, but his voice was stripped of strength and certainty. Soft and trembling, it carried confusion and vulnerability. "So, what should I do, Marcus? How can I find the belief I've never had?" How can I face myself when all my life I've only trusted what was outside of me? Marcus stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Richard's shoulder for the first time. His tone was comforting, yet unwavering, as though guiding someone who had lost their way. You must start by confronting yourself, Mr. Whitmore. You need to look squarely at the truth. You are the only one who can lift yourself up again. You must dare to break down the wall you built and believe that you are capable of doing so. In that moment, Richard Whitmore realized Marcus's words were more than mere advice. They were a declaration of a truth he'd been avoiding for 5 long years, that he had perhaps never truly believed in himself. And it was this harsh, unmistakable truth, more than any scientific proof or financial power, that cracked the bedrock of his once absolute faith. The room felt suffocatingly silent after Marcus left, leaving Richard alone in the fiercest inner battle of his life. The deep cracks in his mind kept widening, chipping away at every argument and belief he'd used his whole life to shield himself from pain. A week passed in that haunting quiet. Richard felt each day stretch into eternity, his mind tormented by endless questions and doubts. For the first time, he no longer felt the strength and confidence that his power had always given him. Instead, he was engulfed by a fear he'd never admitted even to himself. Finally, at the peak of his despair, Richard picked up the phone and, trembling, dialed Marcus's number. It was the first time in his life he'd reached out for help, admitting the deep weakness inside him. The call lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Marcus to understand that Richard was ready to face the thing he feared most. That very afternoon, Marcus returned to the sprawling mansion. Richard sat in his office, looking more haggard and fragile than ever. He did not lift his head. His voice was low and hesitant. "Marcus, I'm ready to try your way. Please tell me what to do." Marcus approached gently and sat opposite him, looking into Richard's eyes with compassion and resolve. "First, Mr. Whitmore, you must confront the memory of when you could still walk. I know this is painful, but you need to truly touch that memory if you want to overcome your fear." Richard clenched his fist as a wave of heartache tightened his chest. He shook his head, voice quivering with desperation. "Marcus, you don't understand. Those memories, they only make the pain worse." Marcus's tone was firm yet encouraging. "Yes, they hurt, but they're also the key to finding belief in yourself again. You've locked your heart and mind away for too long. You must open the door and face the truth if you want to heal." Richard closed his eyes, drew a deep, shuddering breath, and reluctantly dove into the deepest recess of his mind, the memory of the last time he stood on his own 2 feet. He remembered that morning vividly, the sky a crystal-clear blue, the gentle breeze on his face as he stood beside his beloved sports car. He felt the firm press of his feet on the pavement, the power in his hands as he gripped the wheel, the freedom and authority of driving along open roads. Then everything went dark. He recalled the scream of the brakes, the horrifying helplessness as the car went out of control and plunged down the embankment. Richard gripped the armrest, trying to escape that nightmare, but Marcus gently placed a hand on his and said with quiet determination, "Don't run away, Mr. Whitmore. Remember how you felt before the accident. Focus on that feeling, not the fear." Richard trembled, but he chose to follow Marcus's guidance. He forced himself through the pain to recall what it felt like when his legs were part of him, strong, confident, whole. A profound emotion rose within him, infinite regret for what he'd lost. But alongside it came a crucial realization. His body was still intact, still whole, waiting for him to return. For the first time since the accident, Richard opened his eyes and looked down at his legs, not with hatred or despair, but with a fragile, genuine curiosity and hope. He whispered, his voice shaky but sincere, "Marcus, I feel something different this time. It seems my body never really gave up on me. It was my mind that broke." Marcus nodded, smiling gently. "That's right, Mr. Whitmore. Your body never truly abandoned you. It was your mind that built the wall separating you from it. Now, try speaking to your legs again, but this time, truly believe they will answer." Richard drew another deep breath, and his eyes cleared of confusion. He placed his hand on his leg once more, voice far steadier and stronger. "I'm sorry for giving up on you. Please forgive me. Come back to me. Let's stand together again." As he spoke, he felt a gentle yet unmistakable current of energy rise from his legs and spread through his body. A living, vivid sensation he had not thought he'd ever feel again. In that moment, Richard Whitmore understood more clearly than ever. His body had never been destroyed. It was whole and ready to recover. Only his faith had been shattered, and now he stood on the threshold of rebuilding it. Marcus looked at him with pride and confidence, saying softly, "Mr. Whitmore, now you know what was really keeping you from standing. It wasn't your body, but your fear. And you've just overcome the hardest part, facing that fear." For the first time in 5 years, Richard felt a true, powerful, undeniable hope, one that would change his life forever. The moment Richard felt a gentle pulse of life return to his legs, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. He watched him quietly, his gaze soft but steadfast, as if to say there was no other choice but to face and overcome himself. Richard lifted his head to meet Marcus's eyes, his expression for the first time revealing confusion, vulnerability, and a fierce longing. "Marcus, I just felt something, but I don't know what to do next." Marcus offered a gentle smile, slowly moving closer and sitting down beside him. His voice was calm, brimming with encouragement and trust. "Mr. Whitmore, what you just felt is life itself, a true awakening from within. But for your legs to fully heal, you need to do more. You have to connect with the deepest emotions you've buried over these past 5 years." Richard looked at Marcus, fear flickering across his face, but determination shining through. He knew now was not the time to run away. Gently, he placed his hands on his legs, truly reaching out to them from the depths of his heart for the first time. I was so angry with you," he whispered, voice trembling yet sincere. "I blamed you for taking my life. But now I realize I was the one who abandoned you first. I was the one who refused to believe I could ever recover." Silently, Marcus laid a hand on Richard's shoulder, his tone soft but powerful. "Keep going, Mr. Whitmore. Let every true emotion rise up. Let them fuel the strength you need to stand again." Richard inhaled deeply as wave after wave of pent-up feelings crashed through him, each memory of pain, each moment of self-blame, each outburst of rage at his own helplessness. The emotions poured out like a wild torrent, and this time he didn't hold them back. He let them flow freely through his body. With each painful recollection, Richard felt his legs grow stronger in response, a power not born of muscle or nerves, but of the truth he'd long avoided. He was still whole, and he had never truly lost anything. At the peak of his emotional surge, Marcus leaned in, voice tender but commanding. "Now, try to stand, Mr. Whitmore. Trust your legs, and stand for yourself." Richard nodded, his heart pounding as if it would burst. Bracing himself, he placed both hands firmly on the wheelchair's armrests and pushed his weight down into his legs. A wave of tension gripped him as he made the effort. For a fleeting moment he thought his body was ready, but when the weight shifted, he lost his balance and collapsed back into the chair with a painful thud. Defeated, Richard buried his face in his hands, bitter despair and helplessness consuming him once more. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Tears of failure, tears for the anguish he'd carried these 5 long years. Marcus knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. His voice was resolute, yet kind. "Mr. Whitmore, don't give up. This isn't failure. It's just the first step. Remember every agonizing moment, every flash of hopelessness, every surge of anger. Use all of those emotions as your strength. You're not allowed to quit now." Richard raised his head, meeting Marcus's steady gaze. For the first time in years, he felt he wasn't alone. There stood someone who believed wholeheartedly in his ability to perform a miracle. This time, Richard unleashed everything he had. He poured his anger, his frustration, and his fragile hope into his legs. He let out a roar, not of rage, but of unshakable conviction, a release of every chain that had bound him these years. "I will not give up. I refuse to live in fear and failure any longer." His teeth clenched, every muscle quivered, sweat beading on his brow. The tension in the room soared. Then, as if by magic, he sensed his legs answering him. A genuine strength blossomed from within, coursing powerfully through his body. But now, it wasn't just physical effort that lifted him, it was his spirit. He realized this battle was no longer against his body, but against the deepest fear in his mind. Marcus squeezed his hand, voice ringing out, strong and encouraging. "That's it, Mr. Whitmore. That's exactly what you needed. Use all your emotional strength and stand for yourself." Richard roared again, not with anger this time, but with fierce belief, a complete liberation from every restraint of the past 5 years. And then, to his own amazement, Richard Whitmore rose slowly from his wheelchair, his legs trembling but holding firm as they supported his full weight. Marcus smiled, pride shining in his eyes as he watched. In that moment, Richard Whitmore knew he had witnessed a true miracle, not born of science nor of wealth, but of the awakening power of belief in one's own heart. The moment Richard rose from his wheelchair, the room froze in stunned silence. He himself could hardly believe what had just happened. After 5 years of despair, countless failures, and shattered faith, he had finally stood on his own 2 feet. All the emotions he'd bottled up during those years of suffering exploded at once, and tears streamed down his proud face. Marcus stood beside him, his eyes shining with pride and calm reassurance, as if he'd known from the start that this miracle would come. He stepped forward and gently took Richard's hand to steady him. Richard looked at Marcus, his lips trembling as he spoke through his emotion. "Marcus, I did it. I really stood up." The boy smiled warmly and nodded encouragingly. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, you did it. But this is only the first step. Now you understand what truly creates miracles, right?" Richard's legs still trembled, and his vision blurred with tears, but for the first time in years they weren't tears of pain or despair. Instead, they were tears of overwhelming joy and genuine awe, emotions he never thought he'd feel again. He glanced at the wheelchair, the symbol of his helplessness and limitations that had been his constant companion for half a decade. But now, it held no power over him. Richard wiped his tears with a shaky hand and whispered, still struggling to believe what had happened. "Marcus, I spent my whole life believing in science. I believed that only the greatest doctors in the world could heal me. But now, Was all of that wrong? Marcus gently guided Richard to a nearby chair and sat facing him, his eyes bright with wisdom beyond his years. Mr. Whitmore, science isn't wrong, and neither are those doctors. The issue was that you placed all your faith outside yourself, in people and things you thought were capable of saving you, without ever truly believing in yourself. He paused, looking deeply into Richard's eyes as if opening a new door for the man who had lost all hope. Science relies on facts, data, and what can be measured, but it has its limits because it cannot measure the true power of belief. Belief transcends physical and logical boundaries. It's the force inside every person, the power to turn the impossible into the possible. Richard listened intently to Marcus's words, his heart opening to the profound truth the boy had spoken. Indeed, for all these years, he'd locked himself within the limits set by science and society. He'd given up before ever testing the strength that lay within himself. Richard bowed his head, his voice soft but filled with sincere humility. Marcus, you're right. I lost myself all this time. I blamed the outside world and the doctors for not healing me, but in truth, I was the one who gave up on myself first. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Richard's trembling one, his tone full of empathy and resolve. Mr. Whitmore, the most important thing is that you've realized that now. Belief isn't easy, especially for someone who's been hurt as deeply as you have. But once you've found it again, there's nothing you can't overcome. Richard lifted his gaze to Marcus, gratitude and respect shining in his eyes. Who are you, Marcus? How can a boy like you understand such profound truths? Marcus smiled gently, eyes reflecting both sorrow and deep kindness. I'm just someone who watched a loved one lose faith in themselves and paid a heavy price for it. I learned that real strength comes from within. I only wanted you to understand that, so you wouldn't have to suffer as my loved one did. Richard sat quietly for a long moment, realizing Marcus was no ordinary child, but a soul wise beyond his years, his own pain having matured him enough to transform the life of a powerful yet vulnerable man. At last, Richard spoke from the depths of his heart, his voice brimming with genuine humility. Marcus, I owe you the deepest apology and my heartfelt thanks. You've shown me something no doctor, no amount of money in the world could ever give me. You've taught me that true belief is the greatest miracle of all. Marcus returned his smile, eyes glowing with fulfillment and hope. No, Mr. Whitmore, I did nothing. You created this miracle yourself. I only helped you realize you always had the power to change your life as long as you believed in yourself. In that moment, Richard Whitmore understood he had fought and won the fiercest battle of his life, the victory of true belief, the kind he had thought he'd lost forever, but had now reclaimed through the power of his own inner strength. The moment Richard rose from his wheelchair, the room froze in stunned silence. He could hardly believe what had just happened. After 5 years of despair, countless failures and shattered faith, he had finally stood on his own 2 feet. All the emotions he'd bottled up during those years of suffering burst forth, and tears streamed down his once proud face. Marcus stood beside him, his eyes shining with calm pride, as though he'd known this miracle would come all along. He stepped forward and gently took Richard's hand to steady him. Richard looked at Marcus, his lips trembling as he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus, I did it. I really stood up. The boy smiled kindly and nodded, encouragement in every gesture. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, you did it. But this is only the first step. Now you understand what truly creates a miracle, right?" Richard's legs still trembled, and his vision blurred with tears, but for the first time in years, those were not tears of pain or despair. They were tears of boundless joy and genuine wonder, emotions he never thought he'd feel again. He glanced at the wheelchair, the symbol of his helplessness and confinement that had been his constant companion for half a decade. Now, it no longer held any power over him. Richard brushed away his tears with a shaky hand and whispered, still in disbelief, "Marcus, I spent my whole life believing in science. I believed that only the greatest doctors in the world could heal me. But now, was all of that wrong?" Marcus gently guided Richard to a nearby chair and sat across from him, his eyes bright with insight beyond his years. "Mr. Whitmore, science is not wrong, and those doctors are not wrong. The issue was that you placed all your faith on the outside, in people you thought could save you, without ever truly believing in yourself." He paused, looking deeply into Richard's eyes, as if opening a new door for the man who had lost all hope. "Science is built on facts, data, and what can be measured, but it has its limits because it cannot measure the true power of belief. Belief transcends physical and logical boundaries. It's the force inside each of us, the power to turn the impossible into the possible." Richard listened intently, his heart opening to the profound truth the boy had spoken. Indeed, for all those years, he had locked himself within the confines set by science and society. He had given up before ever testing the strength that lay within him. Richard bowed his head, his voice soft yet filled with genuine humility. "Marcus, you're right. I lost myself all this time. I blame the world and the doctors for not healing me. But in truth, I was the one who gave up on myself first." Marcus placed a gentle hand on Richard's trembling one, his tone both compassionate and resolute. "Mr. Whitmore, the most important thing is that you've realized it now. Belief isn't easy, especially for someone who's been hurt as deeply as you have. But once you find it again, there's nothing you can't overcome." Richard lifted his gaze to Marcus, gratitude and respect shining in his eyes. "Who are you, Marcus? How can a boy like you understand such profound truths?" Marcus smiled softly, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and deep kindness. "I'm just someone who watched someone I love lose faith in themselves and pay a heavy price for it. I learned that true strength comes from within. I only wanted you to understand that, so you wouldn't suffer like my loved one did." Richard sat quietly for a long moment, realizing Marcus was no ordinary child, but a soul wise beyond his years, his own pain having crafted him into someone capable of transforming a powerful but broken man's life. At last, Richard spoke from the depths of his heart, his voice brimming with sincere humility. "Marcus, I owe you my deepest apology and heartfelt thanks. You've shown me something no doctor, no amount of money in the world could ever give me. You've taught me that true belief is the greatest miracle of all." Marcus returned his smile, eyes glowing with fulfillment and hope. "No, Mr. Whitmore, I did nothing. You created this miracle yourself. I only helped you realize you always had the power to change your life, as long as you believed in yourself." In that moment, Richard Whitmore understood that he had just witnessed not only a physical miracle, but a true rebirth of his spirit, one that had lain paralyzed for years, but was now at last truly free. After that fateful afternoon with Marcus, Richard's life changed completely. It wasn't just that his legs had healed. More importantly, his heart had been awakened after 5 years spent in darkness. The change was so profound and noticeable that even those closest to him could hardly believe the once powerful, cold, and ruthless billionaire standing before them. The first thing Richard did was to make amends for his past mistakes. One of the very first people he thought of was George, the loyal gardener he had cruelly fired over a minor mistake. Richard sought him out and personally invited him back, not merely to resume his old duties, but as something more. Standing before the elderly man in his garden, Richard bowed his head for the first time in his life and spoke with genuine remorse. "George, I treated you terribly. I looked down on you and punished you for a small error. I'm truly sorry. Will you please come back, not just as my gardener, but as a friend and a teacher who shows me the real value of compassion?" George was so surprised he could scarcely speak. The frail man, who had endured so much bitterness at Richard's hands, now had tears in his eyes. He placed his gnarled hand on Richard's shoulder and answered, voice trembling with emotion, "Mr. Whitmore, I always hoped you'd one day find mercy in your own heart. Today, I'm overjoyed to see it's finally happened." From that day forward, Richard not only restored George's job and dignity, but also ensured the gardener's family lived in comfort. And it didn't stop there. Richard reinstated every employee he had unjustly dismissed, offering them fair wages, respect, and care he had never before shown. Yet Richard knew this wasn't enough to truly atone for his past. He realized there were countless others out there like he had once been, powerless, desperate, and shackled by the wrong beliefs. So he used his vast fortune to establish a foundation called Light of Belief, aimed at helping those who medicine had given up on. At the foundation's center, Richard rejected standard medical approaches and instead applied the principles Marcus had taught him. He frequently met patients in person, sharing his own miraculous recovery story. He spoke to them about the power of belief, the innate healing ability within each person, something no technology or drug could ever replace. The most moving moment came on a spring day when a boy named Daniel, suffering from a rare neurological disorder deemed incurable by doctors, was brought to meet Richard. Looking into Daniel's fearful, despairing eyes, Richard saw his former self. He gently took the boy's small hand, gazed into his clear eyes, and spoke with unwavering hope. "Daniel, I was once just like you. I thought I'd never stand again. But then someone special taught me that the greatest miracle lies within each of us. If you believe in yourself, nothing is impossible." Daniel looked at him skeptically at first, but gradually belief kindled in his eyes. For days, Richard guided him, helping him connect mind and body just as Marcus had done for him. Then, one bright morning, the miracle happened. With Richard's encouragement, Daniel stood up from the wheelchair he once believed would imprison him forever. Everyone in the center burst into tears, witnessing a true marvel, the miracle of unshakable belief. Richard hugged Daniel, tears of gratitude streaming down his face. He knew Marcus hadn't just saved his life. Through him, Marcus had saved many more. In that moment, Richard realized he had truly redeemed his past mistakes. That afternoon, Richard walked alone through the vast gardens of his Connecticut estate, the place where he had endured his darkest years. His steps were steady on the green grass, no longer trembling or weak. He admired the blooming flowers and felt the gentle breeze on his face, and for the first time in years, he was grateful for every moment life had given him. He stopped at his favorite bench and watched the sun dip below the horizon. His voice was soft, as if speaking to himself. "Marcus, thank you for coming into my life. You've shown me that the greatest miracle isn't learning to stand on my feet, but awakening the heart that had lain dormant all those years." Richard took a deep breath, his heart filled with peace and contentment. He knew he would never return to his former ruthless life. That fateful encounter with Marcus had not only healed his legs, but, more importantly, had resurrected his heart and soul, the greatest and most precious miracle anyone could ever receive. Richard's life was forever changed, not merely by the physical healing of his legs, but by the true healing of his heart. From a cold, callous billionaire, he had become a symbol of hope and faith, spreading real miracles to countless lives through the power of inner belief. What about you? Do you believe in the power of faith and the miracles within yourself? Share your thoughts on this moving story in the comments below. If you found today's tale inspiring and meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more uplifting stories like this. See you next time.